So data governance is the question of who can access, modify, or delete data. As your professor, I can change your grades. That is a power that I have. Your grades are the data. I can modify them. Now, as a professor at CSC, I can look up your grades in other courses if I wanted to, but I don't have the ability to change those grades. So I have access to that data, but I can't modify it versus your grades in this course, which I have access to and can modify. This is an example of data governance. So this concept of data governance can be broken down a little further. For example, we can ask about data ownership. And data ownership is the question of who, at the end of the day, is accountable for the data. So let's go back to the grade book. Um, this is data and I own it. So suppose that you complete a project in this class and you do great, and I tell you 100%. But when I go to the grade book, I leave out the one and enter zero by mistake. Well, that's an error, and it's my error because I own the data and am accountable for the data. My dean, my boss, the dean of this college, she has access to your grade book. She could look at it if she wants to, but she doesn't have ownership of it. It's not the dean's fault if the data gets messed up. It's my fault as the owner of the data. So access control, another concept of data governance, is the question of who can access data. Again, going back to the grade book, I can access it. You can access part of the data, and my dean can access it. So I can access all student grades, my dean can access all student grades, you can access your own grades. That's a matter of access control. Um, what has happened in the past, I think we're on top of it now, is that occasionally we'll change who's teaching a class, and the old professor will retain access, and they'll have access to the grade book, even though they're really not supposed to. And when that happens, to be clear, we get it fixed right away, but that's a problem of access control. That's somebody having access to the data who doesn't have a legitimate need to access the data. So another issue related to data governance is quality standards and quality control. What data gets put in the data set and what data is omitted. Like, for example, if I'm interested in calculating student grades on a test, well, it's very common when you're calculating grade averages to just ignore the students who didn't take the test, because if they didn't even take it, they're clearly not giving you a proper notion of how the class performed on it. Well, if you omit those students, then you're making a statement about quality standards. You're saying, well, for this task that I'm performing, this data is not valid. I only want to look at the students who took the test. Or, I mean, as another example, a kind of rudimentary one, but I was entering grades recently and I saw that a student had a 101% in the class. And, I said, well, that can't be right because there's no extra credit. You should not be able to get a grade above 100%. Again, that was an issue with quality standards, a rather uninteresting issue. I accidentally gave the student an 11 out of 10 on an assignment, but an issue nevertheless. So quality standards is going to be closely tied to the concept of data cleaning, which we'll get to later. When we have imperfect data and we want to use it anyway, how are we able to proceed? Finally, we have retention and archiving, which is basic. I mean, okay, you're done with the data. What happens to it now? This is another question of data governance. So sometimes the issue is the answer is that the data is retained. So again, coming back to student grades, I can access grade books from any year on Canvas. I'm no longer using that data for anything, but the data still exists. The data has been automatically archived, we would say. Contrast that to another set of data that I've done some work with, student success data from the business department. I and some other business faculty were looking at how students do in their classes, their in-person classes versus their purely online classes. Now, that data contains a lot of really sensitive information. And it was sitting there in an Excel sheet. So the question of what do we do with the data when we're done with it becomes a very real question. That data, that confidential data, can't just be allowed to float around on random professors' laptops. So the question of shredding that data, of destroying it once we were done with it, is again a question of data governance. Um, One last thing I should emphasize is that every project has questions of data governance associated with it. You might hear data governance and it's a very grand phrase. And you might think, well, these are questions you ask when you have 50 different people working on a project together. But even very small projects have to ask questions of data governance, even if they do it informally. I mean, if when we decided, again, going back to my project with the business department, when we decided that all of the members on the project would have access to the spreadsheet, we might not have been explicitly thinking in these terms, but we were making a decision about data governance. And again, when we decided, well, we need to shred this data now, nobody probably was nobody said the phrase data governance out loud during that discussion, but it was still a question of data governance. So this might come across as picky and bureaucratic, but it's really vital, even for very small projects with just one or two people attached to them.